He sat in that courtroom with an almost icy calm, as if everything happening was just a regrettable mistake rather than a murder charge that could send him to prison for the rest of his life.
And then guilty or not guilty? Guilty. Guilty of what? Guilty of what degree?
Brian Fanion had once been a detective with the Westfield Police Department, a man who had spent more than 30 years investigating crimes and analyzing crime scenes. He understood the system that was now judging him very well. He knew exactly what investigators looked for when they stepped into a house where someone had just died. He knew how forensic experts read bloodstains and bullet trajectories. In the Westfield, Massachusetts community, Brian was not just a longtime cop. He was a man of reputation, a deacon at Wyben Union Church, and the father of 2 children, Travis and Victoria. On the outside, his life looked like the model of a stable family. Brian had been married to Amy Fanion since 1985, and the two had lived together for more than 30 years. But by 2017, a secret began to emerge behind that marriage. During a mission trip in Mexico, Brian met a woman named Corey Knowles.
If somebody was to say, "Who's Corey? Who are you?"
What started as casual conversations quickly grew more intimate, and according to prosecutors later on, Brian began envisioning a new life without Amy. Divorce could cost him a significant portion of his pension after more than 3 decades as a police officer, and that was something he did not want. At noon on May 8, 2018, Brian Fanion picked up the phone and called 911. He told the dispatcher that his wife had just shot herself.
911, this line is recorded. What's the address of your emergency?
Hi, this is Brian Fanion. I'm at North Road. My wife just shot herself. Can you send me some help?
All right, Brian, we'll get him right out there, okay?
A short statement that sounded like the beginning of a tragic suicide, but that call would later trigger a years-long investigation. This is the case of a police detective whose midday 911 call led to an investigation that changed the entire course of his life. And every detail you are about to hear has been pieced together from court records, police reports, phone data, and forensic conclusions in the Amy Fanion case. Around 11:45 a.m. on May 8, 2018, Detective Brian Fanion left the Westfield Police Department for his usual lunch break. Westfield is a small city in Massachusetts where many people were accustomed to seeing Brian in his police uniform or in his role as a detective in the investigations unit. After more than 30 years with the Westfield Police Department, leaving headquarters at lunchtime and driving home to North Road was completely routine for him. North Road was quiet at that time of day, with old houses lining both sides, surrounded by wide lawns and mature trees. The Fanion's home was one such house. It was an over 200-year-old colonial, a detail Amy Fanion always took pride in when talking about where she lived. Amy, then 51, was home when Brian pulled into the driveway. According to what Brian later told investigators, Amy was preparing lunch in the dining room when he walked in. On the table was a plate with a peanut butter sandwich. It was a simple meal, like so many other lunches in their more than 3-decade marriage. But according to Brian, the atmosphere in the house that day was far from normal. He said they had been arguing since the previous evening, and the argument continued as soon as he entered the dining room. The topic of the dispute, according to Brian, centered on their future after his retirement. After more than 30 years in law enforcement, Brian was preparing to enter a new phase of life. But Amy had different ideas about life after he left the force. Brian said Amy wanted to keep the old house on North Road, the home she loved and had spent years caring for. Brian said he didn't want to keep maintaining an old house that needed too many repairs. The argument also extended to other issues. Brian said Amy wanted to keep having dogs in the house, while he wanted more freedom to travel after retirement. Those seemingly minor things, according to Brian, made Amy angry. He said Amy could be very hot-tempered in their private arguments. In his statement to police, Brian said that at one point during lunch, he needed to use the bathroom. Before leaving the dining room, he removed his service weapon, a Smith & Wesson M&P .45, from its holster and placed it on a cabinet in the dining room. Brian said that was his habit when at home. He left the dining room for just a few minutes. When Brian returned, according to him, the scene had changed. He said Amy was holding the gun in her hand. According to Brian, Amy was standing near the dining table facing him. Brian said Amy said something along the lines of, "Maybe you don't want me around anymore." That was the phrase he repeated multiple times when recounting the story to police. Brian said he was standing about 4 to 5 feet away from Amy when it happened. He recounted that he tried to step forward to stop her, but was too late. According to Brian, the gun fired almost immediately. The sound echoed in the small room. Amy Fanion fell to the dining room floor. The bullet struck her head. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. He said he ran to his wife and tried to hold her. The room suddenly became silent. Lunch was still on the table. The peanut butter sandwich remained uneaten. The plate and utensils were still there as if the meal had just begun. According to Brian, he stayed with Amy for a few minutes before picking up the phone. Around 12:30 p.m. that day, Brian Fanion called 911. The call was recorded. When the dispatcher answered, Brian said his wife had just shot herself. He requested an ambulance be sent to the house on North Road immediately. In that call, Brian said Amy had taken his gun and killed herself while they were arguing. To those who heard the call, the story sounded straightforward. A domestic argument, a moment of impulse, a gun left on the cabinet, and a death that happened in seconds.
She has the gun pointed up to the right side of her head. What did you hear her say?
I think she said, I guess you don't want me around, or you don't want to be around me.
Was she seated or
No, she stood up.
She was standing? Okay.
Around 1 p.m. on May 8, 2018, Massachusetts State Police investigators began arriving at the house on North Road after the 911 call reporting a suicide. In cases involving death, especially with firearms, state police are often called in to assist. When they entered the Fanion home, the atmosphere inside was heavy and quiet. In the dining room, Amy Fanion was found lying on the floor, her body tilted to one side in a pool of blood that was beginning to coagulate. She had been shot once in the head. The room looked as though lunch had just started, but never finished. On the table was still a plate with an uneaten peanut butter sandwich. Next to it was another plate with blood spatter on the surface. Small details like that often go unnoticed by outsiders. But to crime scene investigators, everything in the room could be a clue. The Smith & Wesson M&P .45, Brian Fanion's service weapon, was found near the stairway area leading to the breezeway of the house. The gun was not right next to the victim's hand as in many suicides, but was some distance away. Investigators began examining the bullet's path. They determined that the bullet had passed through Amy Fanion's head and continued across the room before stopping in the enclosed porch area outside. Meanwhile, the spent casing remained in the dining room, near where the gun was believed to have been fired. These details helped them start reconstructing the shot's trajectory. The victim's position, the gun's location, and the bullet's direction were carefully documented. Every centimeter in the room was photographed and measured. Meanwhile, Brian Fanion was sitting in the house with the Westfield police chief. He appeared stunned but was still able to speak with those around him. Brian said everything happened very quickly. He recounted that Amy had picked up the gun and shot herself just seconds after he returned to the dining room. To those hearing the story for the first time, the explanation sounded simple: an argument, an impulsive moment, a single shot. But to investigators who had handled many violent scenes before, the room began raising a few questions. In gun suicides, the weapon is usually very close to the victim, sometimes still in the hand or right beside the body. Here, the gun was near the stairway to the breezeway. The bullet didn't stop near the victim, but traveled across the room. Amy Fanion's position on the floor also made some investigators look twice. There were no signs she had moved much after the shot, but the body's position and the gun's location didn't fully align with what they typically saw in suicides. These details weren't enough for an immediate conclusion, but they were enough to make some in the investigative team linger longer at the scene. One investigator later recalled that right from the first observation, he felt something wasn't quite right. Everything in the room seemed too orderly compared to what he expected after a gun suicide. Lunch remained untouched on the table. Items around were barely disturbed. The traces in that room would later be documented, measured, and analyzed over many days. Crime scene photos, diagrams of the gun's position, the bullet's trajectory, and the victim's location were all entered into the investigation file. Around 2:41 p.m. on May 8, 2018, just a few hours after the 911 call, Brian Fanion was taken to the Massachusetts State Police Barracks in Russell for formal questioning. The interview was recorded, and for the investigators, this was a critical step in understanding exactly what had happened in the North Road house earlier that day. Brian was no stranger to interrogation rooms. After more than 30 years in law enforcement, he had sat on the other side of the table, questioning suspects and witnesses. This time, his role was reversed. In the interview, Brian began recounting the entire incident as he remembered it. He said the argument between him and Amy had started the previous evening and continued into that lunchtime. The main topic, according to Brian, was his retirement plans after more than 30 years in policing. Brian said Amy wanted to keep the old house on North Road, where she had spent years caring for it and saw it as a family home. Brian said he didn't want to keep maintaining an old house needing lots of repairs and costs. He told investigators that Amy was very attached to the house and the argument made her angry. Brian also said Amy could have angry outbursts but only showed them to him, not to friends or family. According to Brian, Amy stayed calm with everyone else, but when it was just the two of them at home, she could express her anger. As investigators continued asking questions, Brian described what he said happened when he left the dining room for the bathroom and returned. He said that when he came back, Amy was holding his Smith & Wesson M&P .45. But when investigators asked Brian to describe Amy's exact position in the room, his answers began to shift. Initially, Brian said Amy was standing near the dining table when he saw her with the gun. Later, when asked again, he said she might have been sitting before standing up. At another point in the interview, Brian said he wasn't sure she was standing or sitting at the exact moment the gun fired. Details like that might seem minor, but to investigators, they were crucial. They kept asking Brian about the distance between him and Amy when the gun went off. Brian said he was about 4 to 5 feet away from Amy. He insisted the gun was very close to Amy's head when it fired. According to Brian, the shot happened almost immediately after he returned to the dining room. But when investigators asked him to describe the sequence step by step, the story began to have small changes. At one point, Brian said he saw Amy raise the gun to her head. At another, he said he only saw her arm moving. Details like that forced investigators to re-ask the same questions in different ways. Brian continued to insist that Amy had shot herself. He said everything happened too fast for him to do anything. Throughout the interview, Brian maintained a fairly calm tone. That isn't always unusual, but in this case, it caught the investigators' attention. Brian wasn't an ordinary witness. He was a veteran detective. He understood very well the importance of every detail when describing a scene. He also knew those details would later be compared to forensic evidence. When investigators reviewed the interview transcript later, they began noticing that some details in Brian's account weren't entirely consistent. There were no major changes to the overall story, but many small details shifted with each answer. For seasoned investigators, those small changes can carry big meaning. Someone who just witnessed a shocking event might misremember a few details, but a detective with years of experience usually knows those details will be scrutinized. In the course of investigating what happened that lunchtime on May 8, 2018, investigators didn't focus only on the crime scene and Brian Fanion's statements. They also began examining his personal life. In many cases, what happens outside the scene sometimes provides key clues about motive. And in Brian Fanion's case, investigators quickly discovered that his more than 3-decade marriage to Amy wasn't entirely as it appeared. While examining phones and electronic devices, police found that Brian had a relationship with a woman named Corey Knowles, 48 years old. Corey lived in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and was also involved in religious activities like Brian. According to what Corey later told police, she and Brian first met in November 2017 during a mission trip to Mexico. The trip was organized through the church, where many volunteers participated in community activities. While working together, Brian and Corey began talking more. At first, their relationship was just friendly conversations, but over time, those conversations became more personal. Investigators later determined that the relationship between the two had developed into a secret romantic affair in the following months. When digital forensics experts began analyzing Brian's phone, they found many messages had been deleted. However, using data recovery methods, they were able to retrieve a large number of messages between Brian and Corey. Those messages showed the level of intimacy in their relationship. Among them were clearly romantic messages. Investigators paid particular attention to messages sent right before Amy Fanion's death. On May 7, 2018, just one day before the incident, Brian and Corey exchanged a total of 72 messages. The conversation lasted all day. In one message sent at 9:23 p.m. that evening, Brian wrote to Corey, "Good night, my love." Corey replied with a similar message, saying she would dream about Brian and their future. Those messages showed the relationship was more than just friendship. The next morning, May 8, 2018, the conversation continued. Around 10:30 a.m., Corey sent a message asking Brian, "When can I hold you again?" Brian replied shortly after, "Not soon enough." Those messages were sent just hours before Amy Fanion was shot dead in the house on North Road. For investigators, the timing of those messages became especially significant. Just about 2 hours after that exchange, Brian called 911 and said his wife had shot herself. When police spoke with Corey Knowles during the investigation, she described her relationship with Brian as romantic. Corey said Brian often talked about his marriage and the difficulties between him and Amy. According to Corey, Brian had also said he was concerned about divorce. After more than 30 years in policing, Brian was approaching retirement and was entitled to a pension. Corey told investigators that Brian believed if he divorced, Amy could get a large portion of that money. According to Corey, Brian didn't want to lose what he had accumulated over years of work. For investigators, this information began painting a broader picture of Brian Fanion's life before Amy's death. The relationship with Corey, the romantic messages, and the financial concerns became important details in the investigation. As the investigation into Amy Fanion's death continued to expand, investigators began looking more closely at the electronic devices Brian Fanion used in his daily life. In many modern cases, phones and computers often contain critical information about a person's thoughts, plans, or concerns before an event occurs. So police seized both the computer at Brian's home on North Road and the computer he used at his office in the Westfield Police Department. Digital forensics experts began extracting and analyzing data from these devices. When they checked the internet search history, certain searches caught the investigators' attention. Among them were phrases like household poisons, carbon monoxide the invisible killer, and common prescription overdoses. These phrases all related to methods that could cause death but were often hard to detect immediately. Investigators compared the timing of these searches to events in Brian's personal life. They noticed many such searches appeared after his relationship with Corey Knowles began in 2017. This led investigators to consider the possibility that Brian may have been researching various fatal methods. Another detail in Brian's computer data particularly interested investigators. On April 27, 2018, just 11 days before Amy Fanion was shot dead, Brian watched a YouTube video about gunshot residue tests, meaning tests to detect gunpowder residue after a gun is fired. These tests are commonly used in forensic investigations to determine the distance between the gun barrel and the victim when the shot occurred. Notably, at that time Brian was not involved in any case requiring research on gunshot residue. Westfield Police Department records showed he wasn't assigned any investigation needing that topic. So Brian viewing a video on gunshot residue tests just days before his wife's death began raising more questions for investigators. During the investigation, police also spoke with Amy's family members. One notable statement came from Amy's sister. At the later trial, she said that in a conversation after Amy's death, Brian told her he had searched online for a phrase that made her uneasy. According to her testimony, Brian said he had searched how to make a murder look like a suicide. Brian explained to her that the search was just out of curiosity after they watched a TV show about crime. But for prosecutors, that information became a key detail when placed alongside other searches on his computer. When investigators and prosecutors reviewed all this digital data, they began arguing that those searches were not random. From the prosecution's view, Brian Fanion may have spent time researching multiple ways to cause death, from household poisons and carbon monoxide to using a gun. Prosecutors argued that researching gunshot residue tests just days before Amy's death showed Brian understood that gunpowder residue could be key evidence in a shooting. According to their argument, all these searches, when viewed alongside Brian's relationship with Corey Knowles and Amy's death on May 8, 2018, began forming a picture they believed was not mere coincidence. In their court argument, prosecutors contended that Brian Fanion had considered various ways to cause death before ultimately deciding to use his own service weapon. When forensic experts began analyzing the details of Amy Fanion's death, the scientific conclusions gradually became the most important factor in the investigation. An autopsy was conducted to determine exactly how the shot occurred. In many gun suicides, forensic signs are usually very clear. When a gun is fired at close range, especially when the barrel is nearly touching the skin, the area around the wound often shows characteristic signs like burns, gunpowder stippling, and stippling small dots from unburned powder particles embedding in the skin. However, in Amy Fanion's case, forensic pathologists found none of these signs around the wound on her head. There was no significant gunshot residue on the skin surrounding the wound, and no stippling that experts typically see in close-range self-inflicted shots. This finding immediately drew investigators' attention because it contradicted Brian Fanion's account. According to Brian, when the gun fired, the barrel was nearly against Amy's head. But if that were true, those characteristic forensic signs should have been present. Ballistics experts later conducted further analysis based on crime scene photos, autopsy results, and the bullet's trajectory. After reviewing all factors, one expert concluded that the shot was most likely fired from a distance of at least 18 inches, or about 45 centimeters. That distance was much greater than what Brian described. Beyond the shot's distance, the bullet's direction of travel was also carefully examined. Based on the wound location and where the bullet was found after passing through the victim's head, experts determined the bullet's trajectory went from above downward. This conclusion also didn't match the scenario Brian told police. According to Brian, Amy had held the gun and shot herself in the head while standing near the dining table. But that posture, according to experts, would be difficult to produce the downward bullet trajectory recorded at the scene. When investigators confronted Brian with these forensic findings and later questioning, he stuck to his original story. Brian continued saying the gun was right against Amy's head when it fired. At one point in the questioning, he even emphasized that the gun was right there, right against her head. However, when investigators compared that statement to the forensic results, the discrepancy between the two versions became clearer. For investigators, these scientific conclusions began undermining the suicide narrative. The shot's distance, the absence of gunpowder residue on the skin, and the bullet's trajectory all didn't match Brian Fanion's description. When they considered these factors alongside other investigation details, investigators gradually reached a key conclusion. Amy Fanion could not have shot herself in the way Brian described. The investigation continued for many months as authorities gathered more evidence, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed digital data. In total, the investigative process lasted about 17 months. Finally, after reviewing all the evidence, prosecutors decided the case needed to go before a grand jury. The case file was presented to the grand jury, where prosecutors began building the argument that Amy Fanion's death was not a suicide, as Brian Fanion claimed in his 911 call at lunchtime on May 8, 2018. On November 6, 2019, after nearly 17 months of investigation, Massachusetts State Police investigators returned to the house on North Road in Westfield. This time, they didn't come to collect evidence or photograph the scene. They came with an arrest warrant. When Brian Fanion opened the door, investigators informed him he was under arrest. The detective, who had spent over 30 years investigating crimes, was now handcuffed in the very house where his wife had died. Brian Fanion was charged with first-degree murder in Amy Fanion's death. In the charging documents, prosecutors argued that Brian had shot his wife on May 8, 2018, and then fabricated the story that it was a suicide. After his arrest, the case moved through years of legal proceedings before going to trial. The trial officially began on February 23, 2023 at Hampton County Superior Court. In the courtroom, the prosecutor presented an overall picture of what they believed had happened. They told the jury about the secret relationship between Brian Fanion and Corey Knowles, the woman he met on a mission trip in Mexico. They presented romantic text messages between the two just hours before Amy's death. Prosecutors also presented data from Brian's computer, including searches about poisons, ways to cause death, and his viewing of a video on gunshot residue tests just 11 days before Amy was shot. And finally, they presented forensic evidence. The scientific conclusions showing the shot that killed Amy Fanion was not fired at close range as Brian described. The defense presented a different story. Brian's lawyers argued that Amy Fanion was hot-tempered and may have acted impulsively during an argument with her husband. They said Amy may have picked up the gun and shot herself. Throughout the trial, the jury heard testimony from a total of 27 witnesses over 12 days of proceedings. Investigators, forensic experts, digital experts, and other witnesses took the stand one by one. After both sides finished their arguments, the jury began deliberations. On March 21, 2023, they returned to the courtroom with the final verdict. Brian Fanion was found guilty of first-degree murder in Amy Fanion's death. Under Massachusetts law, the sentence for this crime is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The detective, who once believed he understood how the investigative system worked, was ultimately convicted by that very system. If you want to follow more true crime cases and detailed analyses like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next cases.